Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, July 26th. Tonight, the Pope continues his reconciliation tour with an hour-long Mass at Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton. The Mass involves an audience of tens of thousands of people and marks the start of the second full day of events for the Pontiff on his visit to Canada. Organizers say the address takes place on the feast day of St. Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, which is of particular importance for Indigenous Catholics. Yesterday, Pope Francis apologized to residential school survivors and their families for the role the Roman Catholic Church played in the schools. Meanwhile, Indigenous leaders in Quebec say their communities also deserve to hear Pope Francis apologize on their soil for the sins of the Catholic Church. Cree Nation Grand Chief Mandy Golmasti says it would be a meaningful gesture. This comes after the Pontiff begged forgiveness yesterday in Alberta. Chief Golmasti was part of the delegation that went to the Vatican earlier this year. This was to hear Pope Francis apologize for residential schools and commit to doing so again in Canada. But church leaders in Quebec aren't expecting the Pope to deliver an apology in the province. More officials from Hockey Canada will appear before a parliamentary committee this week. This comes as fallout continues over the organization's handling of sexual assault allegations. The House of Commons Heritage Committee has called for 2 days of meetings. This as it tries to find out what happened when the organization learned of an alleged group sexual assault involving players in 2018. Hockey's national governing body has been under intense scrutiny since May. This was when TSN reported that it had paid out a settlement to the victim in that case. The controversy grew last week as news broke of another allegation related to an alleged incident in 2003. On the West Coast, British Columbia's public safety minister says the latest round of shootings in public spaces has been unsettling for residents. Mike Farnworth called yesterday's shooting deaths of 2 people and the wounding of 2 others at 4 locations in Langley extremely disturbing. Police say the gunman, who was shot dead by officers nearly 6 hours after the violence began, was known to them via prior contact that had been non-criminal. The killing south of Vancouver occurred a day after 2 men known to police were fatally shot in the resort town of Whistler. Turning to the federal Conservative Party leadership race, where Pierre Poilievre has been given a big-name endorsement in his run for leadership. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper released a short video on Twitter. He said one candidate in the race to lead the party stands out. Mr. Harper says Pierre Poilievre served as a strong minister under him when the Conservatives were last in power. He says Mr. Poilievre has presented solutions to the pressing issues of debt and inflation that are rooted in sound Conservative ideas. This comes as the former leader of Ontario's New Democrats is making the switch to municipal politics. Andrea Horwath says she will run for mayor of Hamilton in the October election. She stepped down as NDP leader after 13 years at the helm. Hamilton Mayor Fred Eisenberger has said he will not seek re-election in the fall after 3 terms in office. All right, well, on the East Coast, the Nova Scotia Legislature reconvened today. This comes as the government introduced a bill to rescind a recommended salary raise for House members. The government tabled amendments that will prevent increasing MLA salaries by about $11,000 a year. The increase was included as part of binding recommendations made by an independent review panel. Each member of the legislature makes an annual salary of just over $89,000. This is a base salary that has not changed since 2013. Ottawa-based tech giant Shopify announced it is laying off 10% of its workforce today. This is because the company says it misjudged the growth of e-commerce. The chief executive says the company bet the amount of shopping people did online instead of at brick-and-mortar retailers would leap ahead by 5 or 10 years from pre-pandemic predictions. But the CEO says that bet didn't pay off as people revert to pre-pandemic shopping habits. The company says the cuts will mostly be to sales, recruiting, and support staff. We've got some good news for the food industry. Stats Canada says sales at food services and drinking establishments made their highest monthly gain since the onset of the pandemic in May. The agency says sales in the subsector increased 3% to $7.4 billion the month before last. The agency says every province reported higher sales, but the biggest increases were in Ontario and Quebec. After the break, a look at the shortage of mustard seeds in Canada. We're going to speak with Dr. Stuart Smyth, an agri-food expert and associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan, about this matter. So stay tuned. We'll have that interview. And of course, more news from around the world only on Forum Daily News. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Industry experts say a shortage in mustard seeds is driving up prices, and it could leave some grocery shelves with low supply before the new harvest reaches markets this fall. France, the world's biggest consumer of mustard, is already facing shortages. Other countries are seeing prices climb as the stock of last year's mustard seeds are depleted. The problem is being caused by a drop in the number of acres of mustard seed planted last year on the Canadian prairies. This is where the majority of the world's mustard seeds are grown. That and a severe summer drought means crop yields are far lower than usual. All right, joining us now to talk more about this is Dr. Stuart Smyth, Associate Professor at the University of Saskatchewan and agri-food expert. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
So let's start with how this shortage is likely to impact Canadian consumers in grocery stores.
Yeah, so as you highlighted in the introduction, that the drop in production last year has reduced the availability of some of the mustard products. So I guess it depends on your level of consumption. If you're like me and you maybe buy 1 or 2 bottles a year, you probably won't notice a great deal of difference. But if you're going through a bottle a month or every couple of months, you'll likely have noticed that there's fewer options or fewer availability, which may last into the fall, into winter even.
Now, considering that Canada is a major supplier of mustard seeds, in fact, we mentioned the majority of the world's mustard seeds are grown in the prairies, how is the shortage impacting the industry, supply chains, and profits?
So because the yield was down so much last year, the mustard manufacturers have a little bit less supply than they would have previously. So that's driven up prices, which has pushed up acres. Farmers planted about 40% more mustard than they would, say, over the past 10 years. So if the weather holds sort of till the end of August, first part of September, we should begin to see that some of those prices start to ease as harvest begins and supplies begin to increase.
And as you mentioned, farmers, can you tell us a little bit more about how farmers are being impacted by this shortage?
Yeah, not so much that they're going to be impacted as a consumer, but the rise in prices has certainly allowed them to have another crop option that has significant higher prices. The price of some varieties of mustard seed is over 3 times higher than it was at this time last year. So farmers typically plant based on price and crop rotations, and mustard obviously has been an attractive alternative for a lot of farmers this summer.
And is there any way that maybe the mustard sector can expand in Canada?
Yeah, I think it could, Nima, that with some of the advances within biotech and the potential to increase traits like drought resistance and yield can certainly contribute to the opportunity for farmers to increase their number of acres that they have normally produced, as I said, sort of in that 400,000 acre range. And it would be great to see it move up to double.
It would be great to see that, definitely. Now, what are you watching ahead of the fall harvest? I know there's a lot of hopes for this fall harvest coming up.
Yeah, the main thing is that the weather patterns we've had over the last month or so with some fairly frequent rains, and if we get another couple of weeks of that, and then we get some nice warm weather through September, October, we should get really good harvest conditions. And when I looked about 10 days ago, the provincial Ministry of Agriculture was listing about 85 to 90% of the mustard acres in Saskatchewan as fair and above. So that would sort of align with at least being on average with the last 10 years. So fingers crossed we get that kind of weather, and we should have normal, if not above normal yields going into the winter Christmas season kind of thing.
All right, and as you mentioned weather, so I want to stay on that point. So we mentioned severe drought also had an impact on the mustard seed production. What other threats does climate change or severe weather pose to the food sector in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the variability in weather patterns certainly can have an influence through the droughts we experienced last year. Um, High winds can certainly flatten crops and greatly contribute to reduced yields. The other thing that happens with changing weather patterns is insect and plant disease expand. So we would expect to see an increase of plant diseases that might commonly be in the United States, or insects that are commonly in the United States, and their range of survivability would begin to move further north into Canada, which would increase the cost for farmers having to control for both of those factors.
All right, Dr. Smyth, thank you for an informative interview.
My pleasure. Have a great afternoon.
Public health officials in Montreal say monkeypox cases in the city appear to be hitting a plateau. But Dr. Genevieve Bergeron says a low vaccination rate and soaring cases in the U.S. could trigger a resurgence of the disease. Last month, public health officials described Montreal as the epicenter of the monkeypox outbreak in North America. And Dr. Bergeron says expanding vaccination was helpful in efforts to control the disease, but the city still has a lot of work to do. Meanwhile, an Ontario Nurses Union is warning that emergency room staffing crunches could become increasingly common in Toronto. This comes after a downtown hospital had to use nursing students and medical residents to backstop its ER over the weekend. University Health Network says it was pressed with workforce shortages and had to support its ER with staff from different units. This included personal support workers, nursing students, and medical residents. Ontario Nurses Association President Catherine Hoy said it was shocking that a Toronto hospital had to call for backup to keep its ER open. In Saskatchewan, the chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations says a missing woman was planning to head to Alberta to see the Pope this week. Her truck and belongings were found near the South Saskatchewan River outside Saskatoon. Bobby Cameron says Dawn Walker's suitcase and her 7-year-old son's iPad were still at her home. Ms. Walker, who is the Federation's CEO, was last seen Friday night in Saskatoon. Police can't confirm yet if her son is also missing or if foul play is involved in their disappearance. A Quebec man who volunteered to fight in the Ukraine war has been killed by a Russian tank shell in eastern Ukraine. The leader of a team of foreign fighters in Ukraine confirmed the deaths of the man and 3 other volunteers. He says 31-year-old Émile Antoine Roy-Sirois died while the team was trying to evacuate a wounded soldier. The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress says it is saddened to learn about his death in Ukraine on July 18th. On the West Coast, British Columbians are bracing for scorching temperatures this week. Environment Canada says the mercury could hit 40 degrees Celsius through to Saturday in some areas. This includes Kamloops, Vernon, the Okanagan, and much of the Kootenays. Parts of the U.S. Pacific Northwest are also baking in some rare extreme heat this week. Forecasters have issued an excessive heat warning for parts of eastern Oregon and Washington that could see 43 degrees, while the usually temperate Portland, Oregon could top 38 today, and Seattle, Washington could hit 32. Meanwhile, 2 of the central characters in America's January 6th riot are back in the national capital, both of them with presidential ambitions. Former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence is speaking at a conservative youth conference, while former President Donald Trump delivers a speech on crime before an allied think tank. A new online poll by Leger and the Association for Canadian Studies suggests neither man would have much impact on how people north of the border view the U.S. All right, turning to a major meeting in Bangladesh of business leaders and officials from 8 developing nations. They say more cooperation is needed among them to overcome dwindling foreign currency reserves, a growing energy crisis, and supply chain disruptions. Representatives from Egypt, Iran, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkey, and Bangladesh, under the banner of D8, or Developing 8 Countries, are discussing alternative trade financing. Bangladesh's foreign minister says the group, with a $5 trillion economy among its members, is working to implement a free trade agreement. This while also increasing the volume of trade. The talks are also exploring ways to boost energy security. Members Iran and Nigeria are among the world's top oil producers. Lebanese lawmakers have voted to use a $150 million World Bank loan to import wheat for its country. The parliamentary vote on Tuesday is aimed at stabilizing bread prices for at least the next 6 months. Lebanon faces a deepening food security crisis. This comes as the country is already mired in an economic crisis that pulled 3/4 of its population into poverty. The country once subsidized wheat imports to keep bread prices affordable, but it is struggling to continue doing so in the throes of a crippling economic crisis. Sprinter Andre DeGrasse is among several top Canadian track and field stars who have withdrawn from competing at the upcoming Commonwealth Games. Mr. DeGrasse ran the anchor leg as Canada won gold in the men's 4x100-meter relay at the recent World Track and Field Championships. The 27-year-old had a bout with COVID-19 about a month ago. He failed to qualify for the men's 100-meter final at the World Championships and pulled out of the 200-meter event altogether. Forum Daily will be right back with major news stories and headlines from around the world after the break, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, you can also check out our website, thenewsforum.ca, and we're more recently available on TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you online, and we'll see you shortly after the break. The Ukrainian military says Russia continues to target Black Sea regions, including Odessa. Missile strikes have hit private buildings and port infrastructure along the country's southern coast. Officials with Ukraine's Operational Command South say the Kremlin's forces used air-launched missiles in today's attack. It comes despite agreements that the two sides signed last week, which were intended to allow grain shipments to resume from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Meanwhile, Russia's top diplomat has repeated his insistence that Moscow is ready to hold talks with Ukraine on ending the war, even though he once again claimed that Kyiv's Western allies oppose a deal. Meanwhile, countries in the European Union have agreed to ration natural gas this winter to protect themselves against any further supply cuts by Russia. EU energy ministers have approved a draft European law meant to lower demand for gas by 15% from August through March. The new legislation lays out voluntary national steps to reduce gas consumption. And if those don't work, it includes a trigger for mandatory moves in the 27-member bloc. Consumer confidence continues to slide south of the border in July. This comes as concerns about higher prices for food and gas continue to weigh on Americans. The conference board says its consumer confidence index fell to 95.7 in July from 98.4 in June. This is largely due to anxiety over inflation that surged to a new 4-decade high last month. Moving to Cameroon now, where French President Emmanuel Macron is in the capital today for a 3-day visit to the Central African country. This is the first leg of his 3-nation tour to Africa. Mr. Macron is expected to discuss the food crisis in Africa provoked by Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as the need for Cameroon to increase its agricultural production. He will also address the country's upsurge in insecurity as Cameroon faces jihadi violence that has spilled over from neighboring Nigeria and an ongoing deadly separatist conflict. This comes as Russia's foreign minister continues his tour of Africa. Today, he said his country supports reforming the UN Security Council to give a more powerful role to developing nations, including African countries. Sergei Lavrov spoke Tuesday in Kampala, Uganda's capital, after meeting with Uganda's president. Uganda is the 3rd stop on Mr. Lavrov's tour of Africa. This comes as Russia tries to break diplomatic isolation over its war in Ukraine. Mr. Lavrov will end his trip with a visit to Ethiopia, the headquarters of the 54-nation African Union. A scientific institute in Poland has classified domestic cats as an invasive alien species, citing the damage they cause to birds and other wildlife. Some cat lovers, however, have reacted emotionally to this month's decision, putting the key scientist behind it on the defensive. A biologist at the state-run Polish Academy of Sciences told the Associated Press that he wasn't prepared for the backlash. He says some media reports created a false impression that the institute wants feral and other cats euthanized. Turning to Russia's move to opt out of the International Space Station after 2024 and focus on building its own orbiting outpost. The country's newly appointed space chief says Russia will fulfill its obligations to other partners at the ISS before it leaves the project. The statement comes as tensions rise between Russia and the West over the Kremlin's military action in Ukraine. The death of an iconic peacemaker has world leaders remembering his work and honoring his legacy. David Trimble helped end decades of violence in Northern Ireland. He did this by negotiating with a former foe in pursuit of a goal they both shared, peace. And that willingness to compromise was remembered on Tuesday on both sides of the Atlantic as world leaders honored Mr. Trimble. He died on Monday at the age of 77. Mr. Trimble shared the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize with John Hume for their work in securing the Good Friday Agreement, which helped end 3 decades of bloodshed that killed more than 3,000 people on both sides of Northern Ireland's separatist conflict. And Liberia is celebrating 2 major anniversaries this year. 200 years ago, freed slaves from the U.S. arrived there, and 25 years later, they declared the country to be independent. Amid the festivities for Independence Day on Tuesday, many Liberians say the West African country's promise is unfulfilled, and too many of its people still live in poverty. Information Minister Letterhood Rennie said that major celebrations for these anniversaries are necessary to build national pride and to honor the work of many to establish the nation. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada.